This is an abandoned train line in New York City. However, this abandoned train line exists somewhere you may not expect, Staten Island. Known for its car-centric lifestyle, the island isn't exactly known for public transit. In fact, its train system is small, disconnected, and doesn't really serve much. However, what if I told you that the Staten Island Railway was actually bigger and was connected to something? Well, you don't need to imagine it. It was a reality for more than 50 years. Then, the typical antagonists of the story came. Robert Moses, suburban sprawl, and competition from cars took a toll on the so-called Northshore branch. And by 1991, the last train ran here. But here's what is interesting. Unlike the other abandoned railways in the city, the city did eventually realize their mistake. So studies were launched into looking whether the branch can be reactivated, either for passenger or freight use. And in an even crazier twist, those studies actually led somewhere, allowing certain parts of the line to be reactivated. And with even more studies underway, it does beg the question, what does the story of the North Shore branch tell us? And what should the future of this quirk in history be? Our story begins with this guy, Erastus Wiman. He was a businessman and developer, and he had one goal: develop Staten Island into a city that can rival that of Manhattan. And to achieve this goal, transportation had to be a major focus, as Staten Island was located in the middle of nowhere. The first part, ferries. There were a ton of ferries scattered throughout the island. Wiman proposed that those ferries be consolidated in a place that is the closest geographically from Manhattan, which is here in northeast Staten Island. However, there was pushback, because, other ferry operators weren't so keen in granting a monopoly to one person. So, Wiman got creative. In one story, he tried to get the owner of the Clifton Ferries, George Law, to sell the rights of that ferry so that Wiman could shut it down and move operations to the northeast. Wiman proposed to name not only the new ferry terminal after him, but also the neighborhood where the new ferry terminal was located. And that actually worked, which is why that ferry and neighborhood are called St. George. But the ferry was half the battle. It only got people to the northeast tip of Staten Island. But what about going further inland? Well, that was a job for the trains to do. Staten Island already had a train on the East Coast for about 20 years. But it was located way too far south, because, it was built to service one of those ferries. But luckily for Wiman, George Law also controlled that train line, and gave up control of that line in exchange for that deal. Now that Wiman and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had control of that rail line, they could now extend it north to St. George, which they did by 1886. But that was just the east side of Staten Island. The north side was growing too. However, they did not have a rail line. So, Wiman proposed a second rail line on the north side, which would then feed into a massive ferry terminal at St. George. That rail line opened in 1886, just in time for the summer season. And Wiman, being the businessman he was, built a ton of summertime attractions, like an amusement park, and relocated a baseball team to the neighborhood. It really seemed like Wiman achieved his dreams of turning Staten Island into a satellite Manhattan, until it was revealed that he had been a pretty big scammer and had forged a lot of documents. But despite Wiman's departure from the Staten Island Rapid Transit Company, the vision of the North Shore branch was not lost. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad wanted to extend it to New Jersey and connect it with their vast freight network. That ended with the Arthur Kill Bridge, and with that, the North Shore branch directly connected with today's Raritan Valley Line. Because of this rail investment, by the early 1900s, business was booming. While passenger numbers were alright, the real numbers came from freight. In fact, the North Shore transformed into a local industrial corridor, and it was thanks in part to the North Shore branch. Major companies like Procter & Gamble opened up shop here. The increased traffic spurred numerous improvement projects. For example, the line was electrified, which not only shaved 10 minutes between Arlington and St. George, but also allowed it to be linked to the rest of the New York City subway and potentially the LIRR Bay Ridge branch, a freight line on the other side of the river. But unfortunately, that did not happen. To expand the reach of the North Shore branch, the Travis branch opened in 1928. Primarily for freight trains, it expanded the North Shore's reach into the west side of the island, which too became more industrial. Finally, there was also grade separation. You see, all these trains, especially freight trains going by, were pretty dangerous. It would back up traffic. So large parts of this railway was elevated and depressed into open cuts in the 1930s to separate trains from pedestrians and cars. All of these rail improvements paid off during World War II. Because the nation was at war, it meant that the industrial bases of the North and West Shores were booming. Freight service picked up, and more passengers began to use the branch to get to work, thanks to gas and rubber rations making it hard to drive. Things were looking great for the North Shore branch. And you would think, after the war, when Staten Island's population would boom once again, the branch would stay. But it didn't. By the end of the war, Staten Island saw a massive population increase, more so than the other boroughs. In fact, Staten Island was the only borough in New York City to consistently gain new people, even as the city as a whole began to lose people. But this growth was different. Instead of growing in the north and east, it was the central and western portions of the island that ended up growing. And instead of the somewhat dense communities and industrial hubs found on the north and east sides of the island, the new growth was way more suburban. As a result, the North Shore branch started to decline. It started with some of the stations being designated as flag stops. Then, outright station closures happened. Port Ivory, which served the Procter & Gamble plant that opened in 1905, closed in 1950. But even that was not enough to stem the losses. So, in 1953, passenger service on the North Shore branch and South Beach branches ended. The third rail, a symbol of what the system could become, which was to be extended as part of the subway, was ripped up by 1955. But despite passenger service ending, freight service continued. In fact, despite an oil tanker colliding with the Arthur Kill Bridge, and thus severing the link between Staten Island with the rest of the National Rail Network, Congress granted money to not only repair the bridge, but to completely replace it with something more reliable. It became this, the Arthur Kill Vertical Lift Bridge. Freight trains started to run on it in 1959. Combined with an earlier extension of the Travis branch to serve a new Con Ed plant, expect the line to get busier. Well, at least for freight. Except a new competition to freight service was about to enter during this time, the automobile. You see, because of suburban development of the island, these new residents wanted cars. Hence, an entire expressway system was planned here. Not just an expressway, but also a direct link to the rest of the city, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, something that had not been achieved yet. And part of that expressway system was a direct competitor to the North Shore branch, as both ran east-west and paralleled each other. But the expressway system would be more convenient for freight movements than the North Shore branch, which only linked to New Jersey and required boats at St. George for destinations further east. That link and part of the expressway opened in 1964, and it began to siphon freight away from the North Shore branch. But despite all of this, the North Shore branch somehow managed to limp along. In fact, by the 1970s, the closure of the Jersey Central's car float yard moved operations to St. George, which made the North Shore branch much more popular. That provided the line with the traffic necessary to avoid abandonment. But that setup at St. George did not last forever, and ended by 1980. And with that, the entire line was back to seeing very little traffic again. The line saw so little traffic that its Travis branch connection to the West Shore was closed during this time. And as St. George continued to be even less relevant for freight, the section between Elm Park and St. George was abandoned in 1989. 1 year later, Procter & Gamble closed its operations in the North Shore. Now that the North Shore branch's last customer was gone, it did not make much sense to continue going, especially when the line was already eroding from decades of deferred maintenance. The last freight trains ran in 1991, and then the branch closed. However, it was not over. As Staten Island continued to grow, its expressways continued to be congested. Thus, discussions of reactivation began. That translated into something. In 2001, a short section of the line was reactivated to serve the Richmond County ballpark. But while construction of that project was going on, New York City was dealing with another problem, and that problem was garbage. Lots and lots of garbage. New York City used to have multiple landfills, but by the 1990s, New York City was just down to one, Fresh Kills in Staten Island. And this landfill was becoming a huge problem, as the natural ecosystem that the landfill occupied became extremely polluted. Not just that, because the trash would sweep into the Arthur Kill, then wash back out onto nearby beaches in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, it was beyond time to shut down and clean up the landfill. But the closure of the only landfill in New York City posed the obvious problems. Namely, where would all of New York City's trash go going forward? And how would New York City clean up the landfill? It was soon determined that rail would be one of the primary solutions to that problem. Namely, trash would be placed into rail cars and be hauled away. And soon enough, because of this, the Northshore branch, now abandoned, became the most feasible place for such operations. The branch's right-of-way still exists. It is still relatively industrial, so it has somewhat of the infrastructure to make this happen. And in its western end, no one lives here, making property acquisition much easier. So in the mid-2000s, plans were drawn up to rehabilitate the Arthur Kill vertical lift bridge and rehabilitate a large portion of the Northshore branch in Arlington. Then, that branch will be reconnected to the National Rail Network. And unlike other plans, that plan followed through. And in 2007, the branch saw its first freight train since 1992. And New York City's waste problem was at least partially solved. An actual plan to reactivate a New York City abandoned rail line actually happens very quickly. I am surprised. Well, not really. Because if something is extremely urgent, has immediate negative real-world impacts, is extremely disruptive, and would be a political liability in the near term, you bet that project will get finished really quickly. And this type of stuff won't get ignored by the media, who loves these types of drama stories, as it generates a ton of clicks for them. But if those problems are fixed quickly, whoever is in power then gets to claim credit, thus boosting their chances for re-election. Once again, the Fresh Kills landfill replacement project was a very urgent project, has immediate negative real-world impacts, i.e. if those aren't tackled, New York City would be covered in garbage, and would therefore translate into a political liability for Bloomberg. So you bet that issue would get tackled immediately. This is also why throughout the 2010s, you would see certain projects in the MTA that were completed early or under budget. For example, after Hurricane Sandy devastated the L train, plans were made to shut down the L train in order to repair the Canarsie tubes. But the L train ran through some of the fastest growing neighborhoods at the time, and the Canarsie tubes was one of the most crowded sections in the subway. It was a very urgent project, a very disruptive project, with extremely negative ramifications if the sitting administration did not get its act together. So the MTA tried. 18 months became 15 months, then became a nights and weekends closure in a pretty controversial move by the Cuomo administration. But even with a less disruptive route, the negative ramifications were still there, given Williamsburg and Bushwick depended on weekend L train riders. So there was every incentive to complete the project on time and on budget. And the MTA did, with the project being completed on time and under budget. Pretty good for a band-aid solution, and if you take in the fact that Cuomo's MTA was notorious for ballooning the cost of transit construction. On the other hand, projects that are not as disruptive won't have the same urgency. The Van Wyck Expressway Reconstruction Project is a classic example of this. The NYDOT maintained the usual 3 lanes in each direction for the vast majority of the project. Because of this, the project was not as disruptive, and the DOT could spend their sweet time repairing it. And anyone who lives in Queens would tell you they absolutely did, because work has been going on for 20 years with no end in sight. I think there's a lesson here for transit construction. Usually the less urgent something is, the lower likelihood that the project will get completed quickly and cost effectively, especially if it is tucked away deep underground like 2nd Avenue or East Side Access. Politicians won't see it, and people won't notice it. It makes it easier for these types of projects to become an endless money pit. But on the other hand, if these projects are more urgent and more visible and more disruptive, people want the project to be completed faster. And there would be an incentive for politicians to quit playing games and end that disruption much faster. Anyway, let's finish out the rest of the story of the Northshore branch. And unfortunately, reactivating the entire branch did not have the same urgency as the closure of the Fresh Kills landfill did. Now that the garbage problem had at least been fixed, calls to reactivate the rest of the North Shore branch continued. But even though reactivation had the support of then Borough President James Molinaro and then Mayor Michael Bloomberg, it did not have the same urgency as the other transit projects. Namely, Bloomberg was way more focused on the Hudson Yards extension of the 7 train, as the redevelopment of Hudson Yards into a business district necessitated a subway line. While the North Shore of Staten Island did see some traffic, it did not carry the same urgency, and therefore was allowed to be sent into purgatory. I see 2 concerns with this. The first is with the North Shore branch itself. Is reactivating this back into a rail line even the right move? The MTA doesn't think so, and I for one agree with the MTA. The rail line is located really close to the water, and rising sea levels would make this a nightmare to maintain. Just ask the Hudson Line or any elevated line close to the water on how that worked out during Hurricane Sandy or even in general. And even if you solve these problems, half of your catchment area is just going to be water. That is bad because when you build out a major piece of infrastructure, it is not cheap. So you maximize the returns by building as many housing units as possible. When half of the potential area is water, well, good luck with trying to make your money back. That is why the North Shore BRT is fine. The structure proposed is much less complex than what is needed for a rail line, and can act as a bus feeder trunk system, where buses further out can use this as an express route to St. George. And if you really want a rail line on the north side of the island, there are other alignments to choose from. Stop focusing on just the North Shore branch. The branch isn't going to be any less expensive than a brand new elevated line when the North Shore branch is literally eroding into the sea and needs to be rebuilt. In other words, parts of the right-of-way don't exist anymore, and you have to rebuild it anyway. So why don't you rebuild it somewhere else? The second concern that I have is the insane timeline for things that are not considered urgent. The North Shore BRT proposal has been in development for at least a decade, if not more. It was only just this year that the final EIS was completed. And honestly, it is probably going to be another 10 years at the very least before we ever see the project get finished. I get that the North Shore branch BRT may not be the most urgent thing in the world, but can we speed up the timeline here? There's no way that new asphalt and lights will take 20 years to finish. Is there something in the water that requires 10 years of studies? Am I missing anything? That not considered urgent is sinister, because any project, no matter how urgent the project could be classified as not urgent, and be left in purgatory. This is dangerous, because no matter how good projects could be, there are clear forces that don't want it, because of insert some really stupid reason here. And these projects being stuck in purgatory is perfect for these forces, because once the government needs money, it becomes real easy to cut funding for these so-called not urgent projects. And then you are back to square one. I hope that the North Shore branch BRT gets done quickly, because it would put whatever that remains of the right-of-way back to good use. Especially when Staten Island continues to grow and playing the one more lane bro card has still not worked. All in all, the North Shore branch has demonstrated its resilience time and time again. Whether its beginnings as a passenger line, then as a freight line that pretty much refused to get abandoned until all possible moves were exhausted, then reborn as a solution to New York City's trash problem. In the process, it has demonstrated that New York City can do things fast and under budget, if incentives align, of course. Anyway, this marks the end of this video. Before I go, I would like to thank Gary Owen for documenting and allowing me to use the photos on his website regarding the North Shore branch. If that is something that interests you, his website is in the description box below. As always, if you like this video, consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.